The village of Ashcombe-on-Wold lay folded into the December countryside like a Christmas card left too long upon the mantelpiece. Frost clung to the hedgerows in delicate silver filigree, and the old yew trees near the church wore their snow with solemn dignity. Smoke curled from chimneys in thin blue ribbons, carrying with it the comforting sense of coal fires, roasting goose, and spiced apples. It was Christmas Eve, and Ashcombe-on-Wold was preparing, as it had done for generations, with an air of restrained festivity and quiet expectation. Miss Jane Marple sat by the front window of Rose Cottage, her knitting needles clicking softly as she surveyed the lane beyond. A sprig of holly lay neatly arranged in a small china vase on the sill, and beside her chair stood a modest Christmas tree, decorated with glass baubles whose colours had mellowed with age. The wireless murmured carols in the background, though Miss Marple listened to them only intermittently, her attention drifting instead to the patterns of village life unfolding before her. Christmas, she had always observed, had a remarkable way of encouraging people to behave very much like themselves, only more so. A figure hurried past the gate, boots crunching over frozen gravel. Miss Marple recognized the brisk stride at once. "Mrs. Hardwick is late again," she murmured to herself, a note of mild amusement in her voice, and when one is late on Christmas Eve, it usually means one has something one would rather not discuss. She returned her gaze to her knitting, though her mind was already busy cataloguing impressions. Ashcombe-on-Wold had been unusually lively this season. There was, she sensed, an undercurrent of strain beneath the ribbons and wreaths, the polite smiles exchanged in the post office, and the cheerful bustle around the village green. Much of it, inevitably, centred upon Greystone Manor. Perched on a low rise at the edge of the village, Greystone Manor dominated Ashcombe-on-Wold both physically and socially. Built in the late Georgian period, it was a handsome, if somewhat severe house, its grey stone facade softened only by climbing ivy and the careful attentions of its long-time owner, Mr. Lionel Pembroke. Mr. Pembroke was a man of consequence, wealthy, well-connected, and not universally beloved. He had inherited Greystone Manor and a considerable fortune some 20 years earlier, and had since made it his mission to manage both with a firm, unmistakable hand. His views were traditional, his manners impeccable, and his temper, when crossed, decidedly formidable. He was not, Miss Marple often reflected, unlike several stern uncles she had known in her youth, men who believed themselves pillars of the community, and could not quite understand why others failed to agree. This Christmas Eve, Mr. Pembroke was hosting a small house party. It was, on the surface, a perfectly conventional affair. A handful of relatives, a few close acquaintances, and the promise of a formal Christmas dinner, followed by carols sung around the piano and midnight service at St. Andrew's Church. And yet Miss Marple paused in her knitting. There had been whispers. It was Mrs. Bantry, visiting from St. Mary Mead the week before, who had first mentioned it over tea. Something odd about Greystone this year, she had said lightly, buttering her scone. Not that Lionel Pembroke was ever a ray of sunshine, but still, people seem on edge indeed. Among the guests invited to Greystone Manor was Mr. Gerald Pembroke, Lionel's nephew, a charming but somewhat unreliable young man who had returned from London under circumstances no one quite understood. Gerald was handsome, agreeable, and perpetually short of money, an unfortunate combination that tended to inspire both affection and mistrust. Then there was Miss Clara Weatherby, Lionel's private secretary. Efficient, discreet, and impeccably dressed, she had been at Greystone Manor for nearly 5 years. The villagers admired her competence, but remained curiously uncertain of her loyalties. Miss Weatherby, Miss Marple suspected, knew far more than she ever allowed to show. Another guest was Colonel Arthur Blake, a retired officer and old friend of Lionel Pembroke's. Bluff, red-faced and fond of his whisky, the colonel had a booming laugh that echoed through the village whenever he appeared. Yet even he, it was said, had quarrelled with Lionel more than once in recent months. Completing the party was Mrs. Elena Finch, a distant cousin whose arrival had caused a mild stir. Widowed, elegant, and possessed of a quietly observant manner, Mrs. Finch had not visited Greystone Manor in many years. Her sudden reappearance, just days before Christmas, struck several villagers as peculiar. And lastly, though not officially a guest, there was Mr. Thomas Reed, the manor's caretaker, a taciturn man with a weathered face and an air of dogged loyalty. Reed had lived on the estate since boyhood. He knew every path, every locked door, every hidden cupboard within Greystone Manor, and had been known to bristle fiercely at any suggestion that the house might change hands. It was into this carefully arranged gathering that Christmas Eve descended. By late afternoon, Greystone Manor glowed warmly against the fading light, its windows lit like watchful eyes. Inside, preparations were in full swing. The long dining table was laid with starched linen and polished silver. Sprigs of ivy adorned the banisters, and a tall Christmas tree stood in the hall, its candles awaiting the moment they would be lit. Lionel Pembroke himself presided over it all with brisk authority, issuing instructions to the staff and casting a critical eye over every detail. "Miss Weatherby," he said sharply, "the seating arrangement, have you corrected it?" "Yes, Mr. Pembroke," she replied calmly, "as you requested. Gerald will be seated opposite Mrs. Finch." Lionel's lips tightened, though he said nothing further. From the drawing-room came the sound of raised voices. Gerald Pembroke emerged moments later, his expression strained. "I don't see why it should matter," he protested. "It's Christmas, Uncle Lionel." "It matters because I say it does," Lionel replied coldly, following him into the hall. "And you would do well to remember whose house you are in." Miss Weatherby watched the exchange with carefully neutral eyes. If Lionel Pembroke was aware that his guests were not entirely at ease, he gave no sign of it. Dinner was served promptly at 7, and for a time the conversation remained safely within the bounds of weather, church arrangements, and the merits of artificial versus real Christmas trees. Yet beneath the polite chatter, tensions simmered. Colonel Blake drank more than usual. Mrs. Finch asked quiet, probing questions. Gerald laughed a little too loudly. Miss Weatherby observed everything, and Lionel Pembroke appeared, to those who knew him well, preoccupied. After dinner, as was tradition, the guests retired to the drawing-room. A fire crackled merrily in the grate, and the colonel insisted upon a final glass of whisky before church. Lionel glanced at the clock. "I shall join you shortly," he said. "There are 1 or 2 matters I must attend to first." He left the room, his footsteps echoing down the corridor toward his study. It was the last time anyone would see Lionel Pembroke alive. At 9:30, when the guests were preparing to leave for the midnight service, Thomas Reed appeared in the doorway, his face ashen. "Miss Weatherby," he said hoarsely, "you'd better come. It's Mr. Pembroke." They found him in the study, slumped over his desk. A glass lay shattered on the carpet, its contents soaking into the Persian rug. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the room. Lionel Pembroke was quite dead. The village would later remember that the church bells rang that night with particular clarity, their notes drifting across the frost-hardened fields as if announcing not only Christmas, but something far more unsettling. By morning, Ashcombe-on-Wold would awaken to a murder, and Miss Jane Marple, listening quietly to the bells from her cottage, would already be thinking of alibis. especially those that relied too heavily on Christmas Eve. Ashcombe-on-Wold woke on Christmas morning beneath a sky of pale winter blue, the frost lying thick upon the ground like spun sugar. Ordinarily the village would have stirred with quiet contentment, children peering into stockings, kettles set to boil, the comforting predictability of Christmas rituals. Instead, a sense of hushed disbelief lingered in the air, passing from cottage to cottage with the milk bottles and morning papers. Lionel Pembroke was dead. By 10 o'clock, a police car stood outside Greystone Manor, its presence both startling and inevitable. Inspector Harold Denton, a methodical man with a neatly trimmed moustache and a habit of listening more than he spoke, had arrived from the nearby market town. He moved through the manor with quiet efficiency, accompanied by a young constable who looked faintly overwhelmed by the grandeur of the house and the gravity of the occasion. Miss Jane Marple arrived shortly after, escorted by Mrs. Hardwick, who had insisted that someone sensible ought to be present. "I'm sure Inspector Denton won't mind," Mrs. Hardwick had said briskly, though her eyes shone with excitement. "After all, you knew Mr. Pembroke quite well, Jane." Miss Marple, wrapped in her sensible tweed coat and clutching her handbag, smiled politely. "I knew him in the way one knows a great many people in a village," she replied, "which is to say, perhaps rather better than one might suppose." Inspector Denton greeted her with courteous respect. He had encountered Miss Marple before, and though he would never have admitted it openly, he had learned not to dismiss her quiet observations. "Miss Marple," he said, inclining his head, "I understand you were acquainted with the deceased." In a modest way, she agreed. "And I imagine everyone here has something to tell you, whether they intend to or not." Her eyes travelled gently around the entrance hall, taking in the arrangement of furniture, the faint scent of pine from the Christmas tree, and the barely perceptible tension that clung to the house like cold. The study had been sealed overnight. Now, with the early morning light streaming through tall windows, it revealed itself as a room of severe order. Bookshelves lined the walls, each volume precisely placed. Papers lay neatly stacked upon the desk, though a few had been disturbed in the course of events. The shattered glass had been cleared away, but a dark stain remained on the rug. "Poison," Inspector Denton said quietly, following Miss Marple's gaze. "Most likely administered in the whisky. The doctor believes it was tasteless and fast-acting. An unfortunate choice for Christmas Eve," Miss Marple murmured. "So often people assume that celebrations provide the perfect cover. In my experience, they do quite the opposite." Inspector Denton raised an eyebrow. "Everyone remembers where they were, you mean?" "Precisely, and they are often most eager to tell you." The guests had been gathered in the drawing-room, each wearing an expression of strained composure. Gerald Pembroke sat near the fire, his face pale and his eyes shadowed. He looked every inch the grieving nephew, though Miss Marple noticed the way his fingers drummed nervously against the arm of his chair. Miss Clara Weatherby sat upright on a straight-backed chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wore a dark dress and appeared entirely composed, though her eyes missed nothing. Colonel Blake stood by the window, staring out at the frost-covered lawn, a glass of water clutched in his hand. Mrs. Elena Finch occupied the sofa, her posture relaxed but her expression thoughtful, as though she were observing a scene rather than participating in it, and Thomas Reed lingered near the doorway, his cap clutched tightly in his hands. Inspector Denton began with routine questions, movements, timings, and impressions of the evening. Each person, Miss Marple observed, answered with careful precision. Gerald spoke first. "I was with the others in the drawing-room after dinner," he said. "We were discussing the church service. I never left the room, not even briefly." Denton asked, Gerald hesitated, well, perhaps for a moment, to fetch my cigarettes, but the study door was closed. Miss Marple's knitting needles were conspicuously absent, yet she seemed to knit invisibly as she listened. Miss Weatherby confirmed that she had remained in the drawing-room until Thomas Reed summoned her. I prepared the day's correspondence earlier, she said calmly. After dinner, Mr. Pembroke excused himself. I did not see him again. Colonel Blake cleared his throat. I had a whisky, he said gruffly, or two, but I stayed put. Lionel and I had words earlier, but we were old friends. I'd no reason to wish him harm. Mrs. Finch smiled faintly. I was here as a guest, she said. I observed, I listened, and I kept to myself. Mr. Pembroke was a formidable man, but not, I think, a man deserving of murder. Thomas Reed spoke last. I was checking the back doors, he said, making sure everything was secure before we left for church. I didn't go near the study. Inspector Denton nodded, making notes. And the whisky decanter, he asked. Miss Weatherby answered. It was kept in the study. Mr. Pembroke was particular about that. Miss Marple's eyes brightened slightly. How very interesting, she said softly. Most gentlemen, I know, prefer their whisky close at hand. Inspector Denton glanced at her, but she said nothing further. As the morning wore on, Miss Marple drifted through the manor, ostensibly admiring the decorations, but in reality observing the smallest details. She noted the faint scuff marks near the study door, the position of the chairs in the drawing-room, and the slight disarray of the sideboard where drinks had been served. In the kitchen she paused to speak with the cook, a stout woman with flour still clinging to her apron. "Did anyone ask for anything unusual last night?" Miss Marple asked gently. The cook frowned. Miss Weatherby asked for a clean glass just before dinner ended. Said Mr. Pembroke had requested it earlier. Miss Marple thanked her and moved on. Later she found herself walking beside Inspector Denton in the cold air outside. "Everyone has an alibi," he said. "Christmas Eve, church bells, the lot. No one was alone long enough." Miss Marple smiled. "Alibis, Inspector, are like Christmas puddings. They look very solid until one begins to prod them with a spoon." She paused, looking up at Greystone Manor. "I think you will find," she added gently, "that someone here has remembered their Christmas Eve rather too carefully." Inspector Denton regarded her thoughtfully. "And you, Miss Marple?" "Oh, I remember it perfectly," she said, "which is why I know that memory can be most deceptive." As she walked back toward Rose Cottage, Miss Marple reflected on the faces she had seen that morning. The eagerness, the restraint, the flickers of fear. Something about the case troubled her. It was not the poison nor the broken glass. It was the alibi, because Christmas Eve, she knew, was a time when people liked to believe they were being watched, and the most dangerous lies were often told when one was certain no one had noticed at all. By the afternoon of Boxing Day, Ashcombe-on-Wold had settled into a peculiar rhythm. Christmas decorations still gleamed in windows, carols played softly on the wireless, and yet conversation everywhere returned, with almost indecent persistence, to Greystone Manor. People spoke in lowered voices, as though afraid the frost itself might overhear them. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped snugly in her shawl, received a steady stream of visitors at Rose Cottage. Each arrived ostensibly to exchange Christmas greetings. Each departed having shared some morsel of information, however trivial it might seem. It was through Mrs. Hardwicke, who prided herself on being useful, that Miss Marple first learned of a quarrel that had taken place earlier in the week. Lionel Pembroke and his nephew had quite the disagreement. Mrs. Hardwicke said, stirring her tea vigorously, "About money, of course. Gerald wanted an advance. Lionel refused. How very sad." Miss Marple murmured, "Money does have a way of spoiling Christmas cheer. But that's not all." Mrs. Hardwicke continued, "Colonel Blake was furious as well. Apparently Lionel intended to sell part of the estate. Miss Marple's knitting paused. "Sell," she repeated mildly, "so they say, and Thomas Reed was beside himself. He's devoted to that place." Miss Marple nodded. She could easily imagine it. She had known men like Thomas Reed before, men who tied their sense of self to land and duty. Inspector Denton called later that day with developments of his own. "The poison has been identified," he said, warming his hands by Miss Marple's fire. "A rare compound, difficult to obtain, and here's the interesting part." He hesitated, clearly enjoying the effect. "It was found in a small bottle in Gerald Pembroke's luggage." Miss Marple's eyes widened slightly. "How very inconvenient for Mr. Gerald." "Indeed, he insists he knows nothing about it." "I expect he does," Miss Marple replied calmly. "Young men with pressing financial needs are often careless about what they carry, and even more careless about what others may put among their belongings." Inspector Denton frowned. "You think he was framed?" "I think," said Miss Marple gently, "that Christmas is a season when people are particularly fond of wrapping things up." Gerald Pembroke, when questioned again, was visibly shaken. "I've never seen that bottle before," he protested. "Why should I carry poison?" Miss Marple regarded him kindly. "My dear boy," she said, "I have known many young men who have carried far more dangerous things without realizing it." Another revelation followed swiftly. Miss Weatherby, pressed by Inspector Denton, admitted that she had been in the study earlier that evening. "Mr. Pembroke asked me to bring him some papers," she said. "I did so, and I left at once." "Did you handle the whiskey decanter?" Denton asked. "No," she replied firmly. "Mr. Pembroke poured his own drink." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on her face. "Miss Weatherby," she asked softly, "may I ask how long you have been in Mr. Pembroke's employ?" "5 years," she replied. "And during that time," Miss Marple continued, "have you ever known him to be careless?" Miss Weatherby hesitated, just perceptibly. "No," she said at last. That hesitation, Miss Marple thought, was far more revealing than any confession. Meanwhile, Colonel Blake's temper grew increasingly frayed. When confronted with the suggestion that he might have slipped poison into his friend's drink, he exploded. "Preposterous!" he roared. "Lionel and I argued, yes, but we'd done that for years. He saved my life once. I'd no reason to kill him. And yet," Miss Marple reflected, "gratitude could sour as easily as resentment. Mrs. Elena Finch remained on the surface, the least likely suspect." She spoke little, observed much, and moved about the house with quiet grace. It was only when Miss Marple encountered her in the small sitting-room, gazing thoughtfully at a family photograph, that something shifted. "Do you find family gatherings difficult?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Finch smiled faintly. "Families," she said, "are built upon memories. Some of them are best left undisturbed." Miss Marple studied the photograph. A much younger Lionel Pembroke stood beside a woman who bore a striking resemblance to Mrs. Finch. "Your sister?" Miss Marple asked. "My cousin." Mrs. Finch replied. "She died many years ago. Lionel was involved." "Involved," Miss Marple echoed softly. Before Mrs. Finch could elaborate, Inspector Denton interrupted with further news. There had been a second incident. The night before, someone had attempted to break into the study. Nothing appeared to be missing, but the lock showed signs of tampering. A desperate attempt to destroy evidence, Denton suggested, or to create it. Miss Marple countered. She requested permission to examine the study once more. Alone, she moved slowly about the room, her eyes tracing the familiar lines of desk and shelves. She noticed something new. The decanter, now empty, had been placed slightly askew. She lifted it carefully. There, barely visible, was a faint smear on the glass. Something oily, a fingerprint, she murmured. But whose, that evening? A fresh disturbance unsettled the household. Thomas Reed was discovered in the servants' corridor, clutching his chest and gasping for breath. The doctor pronounced it a severe attack of anxiety brought on by strain. "It seems Greystone Manor does not take kindly to change," Miss Marple observed quietly. As night fell, the village seemed to hold its breath. Inspector Denton faced mounting pressure to make an arrest. The evidence against Gerald Pembroke, circumstantial though it was, appeared damning. Miss Marple, however, remained unconvinced, because there was one detail that troubled her deeply. Everyone insisted they had remained in the drawing-room during that crucial half-hour. Everyone except Lionel Pembroke, and yet Miss Marple knew from long experience that the most reliable alibis were often those that required no witnesses at all. As she prepared for bed, Miss Marple glanced at her knitting, still unfinished. "So many loose ends," she murmured, "but Christmas Eve, like knitting, always follows a pattern, once one knows how to read it." By the third morning after Christmas, a fragile calm had settled over Ashcombe-on-Wold. The frost had thawed slightly, leaving the lanes damp and glistening, and the village seemed anxious to resume its accustomed routines. But Greystone Manor remained suspended in a state of uneasy waiting, its inhabitants moving softly, as though afraid to disturb the truth before it was ready to emerge. Miss Jane Marple arrived just after 11, her manner as unassuming as ever. She carried a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. A Christmas pudding, she insisted, was quite unnecessary now, but still better eaten than wasted. Thomas Reed accepted it with a murmured thanks, his face drawn and tired. Inspector Denton was waiting in the morning-room. "I believe you have something on your mind," he said, offering her a chair. Miss Marple smiled. "I almost always do, Inspector, but in this case it is less a matter of suspicion than of pattern." She glanced toward the window, where the bare branches of the beech trees etched dark lines against the sky. "You see," she continued, "Christmas Eve is an evening of rituals. People are very particular about where they sit, what they drink, and what they expect to happen next. When something interrupts that pattern, it becomes most noticeable, if one is paying attention." Inspector Denton leaned forward. "I'm listening." Miss Marple began by recounting small, seemingly unrelated details: the cook's memory of the clean glass, the position of the chairs in the drawing-room, the decanter kept in the study. "Mr. Pembroke was not careless," she said. "He poured his own drink, yes, but he did so in a very particular way, always the same glass, always from the same decanter, and someone tampered with it, Denton said." "Yes, but not in the way you imagine." She rose and walked slowly about the room. "Everyone has been focusing on the half-hour after dinner, who left the drawing-room, who did not, but the poison need not have been administered then at all." Inspector Denton frowned. "You think it was earlier?" "I am certain of it," Miss Marple explained. "The clean glass Miss Weatherby had requested had not been for Lionel Pembroke, but for someone else. The whisky had been poured into a different glass earlier in the evening and set aside. A glass that would later be returned to the study," Miss Marple said softly, "and mistaken for Mr. Pembroke's own." Inspector Denton's eyes widened. "But who would have access?" Miss Marple's gaze settled calmly. "Someone who knew the house intimately, someone who knew Mr. Pembroke's habits, someone who had a very strong reason to ensure that no one suspected them." She asked Inspector Denton to gather everyone in the drawing-room. They assembled slowly, tension thick in the air. Gerald Pembroke looked haggard. Colonel Blake's face was flushed. Miss Weatherby sat composed but pale. Mrs. Finch watched with quiet intensity. Thomas Reed stood rigid, his jaw clenched. Miss Marple addressed them gently. "We have all been very busy providing alibis," she said. "Christmas Eve alibis, singing carols, sitting by the fire, remembering where we were." She smiled faintly. But the truth is, the most important moment occurred when no one thought it mattered. She turned to Miss Clara Weatherby. "You were devoted to Mr. Pembroke," she said kindly, "in your own way." Miss Weatherby's lips tightened. "He trusted me." "And yet," Miss Marple continued, "he had recently decided to dismiss you. Had he not?" A murmur rippled through the room. Miss Weatherby's composure cracked. "Just slightly. He said he no longer required my services," she admitted. "After Christmas, and with that dismissal," Miss Marple added softly, "would have come the loss of your home, your income, and, most importantly, your secrets." Miss Weatherby said nothing. Miss Marple continued. "You knew where the poison could be obtained, you knew how to handle it, and you knew exactly how to ensure that suspicion would fall elsewhere." She gestured gently toward Gerald. The bottle in Mr. Pembroke's luggage was placed there deliberately, a simple task for someone who packed his things earlier in the day. Gerald stared at Miss Weatherby in disbelief. "You," he whispered. Miss Marple nodded. "And you, Miss Weatherby, arranged the glass, a clean one. You prepared the poisoned drink before dinner ended, knowing Mr. Pembroke would later retire to his study. All you needed was patience." Miss Weatherby's voice, when it came, was very quiet. "He would have ruined me," she said. "He kept records, things I'd done for him, things I never wanted known." Inspector Denton stepped forward, and the attempted break-in. "A performance," Miss Marple said, "to suggest panic, to suggest guilt." Miss Weatherby closed her eyes. "I only meant to protect myself," she said, "but once begun." Miss Marple's expression softened. "So often," she said, "people confuse control with safety." Inspector Denton signalled to the constable. As Miss Weatherby was led away, the others sat in stunned silence. Miss Marple turned back to Inspector Denton. "The alibi," she said gently, "was Christmas Eve itself. Too perfect, too rehearsed." Inspector Denton nodded slowly. "And you saw through it?" Miss Marple smiled. "I have seen many such evenings, and they always leave a trace." The removal of Miss Clara Weatherby from Greystone Manor was accomplished with quiet efficiency, and yet her absence left a curious stillness behind it, like the sudden cessation of a clock one had grown accustomed to hearing. The house itself seemed to exhale, its corridors no longer taut with suppressed anxieties. Ashcombe-on-Wold, however, did not exhale so easily. The news travelled with remarkable speed for a village whose lanes were still edged with melting frost. By mid-morning it had reached the post office, the butcher's shop, and the farthest pews of St. Andrew's Church. There was relief, to be sure, relief that the murderer had been identified, relief that Christmas need not remain forever tainted, but there was also a deeper unease. Miss Weatherby had been so competent, so reliable, that she should prove capable of murder unsettled the village more than the crime itself. Miss Jane Marple reflected upon this as she sat at a small table at Rose Cottage, trimming a new skein of wool. "It is always the reliable ones," she murmured, "who surprise us most." Inspector Denton called that afternoon, the formalities of his duty largely complete. "I wanted to thank you, Miss Marple," he said. "Once again you have saved us a great deal of time, and quite possibly an injustice." Miss Marple smiled, pouring tea. "Injustices are like draughts," she replied. "One notices them most in old houses." The full unravelling later that day, at Inspector Denton's request, Miss Marple returned to Greystone Manor to explain her reasoning fully to those still gathered there. Though the legal matter was settled, the emotional one was not. People needed to understand, not merely who but why. They assembled once more in the drawing-room, though now the fire burned lower, and the Christmas tree had been stripped of its candles. Gerald Pembroke sat stiffly, his earlier distress giving way to a subdued shame at having been so easily implicated. Colonel Blake leaned heavily on the mantel, his usual bluster entirely absent. Mrs. Elena Finch sat with her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. Thomas Reed stood by the door, his eyes fixed on the floor. Miss Marple spoke gently, as though explaining a difficult stitch to a novice knitter. Miss Weatherby's greatest advantage, she began, was that she appeared indispensable. That, I fear, made her invisible. She explained how Miss Weatherby had controlled the household routines, how she knew exactly which glass Lionel Pembroke preferred, when he would retire to his study, and how the whisky was handled. The poison had been introduced not at the dramatic moment everyone imagined, but quietly, earlier, when attention was elsewhere. Christmas Eve, Miss Marple said, encourages people to think in terms of scenes, drawing rooms, carols, church bells, but life rarely obliges us by arranging itself so neatly. Colonel Blake cleared his throat, and the quarrels, he asked gruffly. Mine, Gerald's, red herrings, Miss Marple said kindly, real enough to feel important, but never truly relevant. Miss Weatherby relied on the fact that people would assume motive lay where emotion was loudest. Mrs. Finch nodded slowly. She was afraid, she said, afraid of exposure. Yes, Miss Marple replied, fear can make even the most orderly mind reckless. Gerald Pembroke spoke at last. I suppose I owe you my freedom, he said quietly. Miss Marple smiled at him. You owe it to your own inconsistency, she said. You were far too careless to be methodical, and method was essential to this crime. He managed a weak laugh. The aftermath at Greystone Manor with Lionel Pembroke gone, the future of Greystone Manor became an immediate concern. His will, read a week later, surprised nearly everyone. The bulk of the estate was left not to Gerald, nor to any distant relation, but to a charitable trust intended to preserve the house and its grounds. Gerald received a modest allowance, enough to live upon, but not enough to squander. Colonel Blake was left a small but affectionate bequest. Mrs. Finch received a personal letter, the contents of which she did not share, though her eyes were moist when she left the solicitor's office. Thomas Reed was retained as caretaker, a provision that pleased the village more than any other. He belongs there. Mrs. Hardwicke declared firmly, always has. Miss Marple suspected that Lionel Pembroke, for all his severity, had known that too. As for Miss Weatherby, she was committed to stand trial. Inspector Denton believed she would confess fully, if only to have her version of events properly recorded. She likes things set down correctly, he said. Miss Marple nodded. Some people cannot bear disorder, she replied, even when it is their own doing. Christmas restored gradually, Ashcombe-on-Wold resumed its gentle rhythms. Decorations were taken down, puddings finished, and the memory of that terrible Christmas Eve softened at the edges. It would be remembered, certainly, but as an anomaly, not a defining moment. One afternoon, Miss Marple walked through the village green, exchanging greetings and mild observations. At the church gate, she encountered Mrs. Finch, who was preparing to leave Ashcombe-on-Wold. I wanted to thank you, Mrs. Finch said, for seeing what others could not. Miss Marple smiled. People are very much alike wherever one goes, she said. One only has to notice. Mrs. Finch hesitated. Lionel was not an easy man, she said, but he did not deserve what happened. No, Miss Marple agreed. Very few people do. That evening, back at Rose Cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting finally complete. Outside the stars shone brightly in the cold sky, and somewhere in the distance a church bell rang for evening prayers. Christmas Eve, she reflected, was a time when people constructed perfect little stories about themselves, where they had been, what they had done, who they had been with. But truth, like time, moved on regardless of such stories. She folded her knitting carefully and placed it aside. The trouble with alibis, she murmured to herself, is that they often tell us far more than the truth ever intended. And with that, Miss Jane Marple rose, extinguished the lamp, and let Ashcombe-on-Wold return at last to peace.